What's up? I'm Robin and I make stuff. Sometimes it's amazing, sometimes maybe not so much, and that's okay. I'm here for all of it. As I'm making this video today, we are approaching Christmas, and what better gift than to give your family something that you make. My brother has 4 little kids, and he said, you know what, Robin, we don't have a lot of space for a lot of things. They would love some artwork. So today I am going to be painting the fox. Now, a fox is kind of thought to be mischievous, right? But they're also really cool looking animals. I love, the coloring that they have and like the big fluffy tail and kind of the darkness on their feet. That's how you can really tell that it's a fox versus like a coyote or just a random dog, like a wild dog, right? I am using the DaVinci Eye app to transfer this drawing to my paper in a way that makes it very simple to trace and get those basic shapes so I know exactly where I'm going to be painting my colors. So let's get into it. Here is the photo that I found online that I'm going to use as a reference, as a guide. It doesn't have to be exactly like this. We're just going to create the idea of it. So as I do with most of my paintings, I'm going to do a wet on wet sky. That just means I'm going to get my paper wet, and then I'm going to drop wet color into it, wet on wet. As you can see in this reference photo, the sky is very blended. It's very soft. So I'm going to start by dropping in color around where that sun is while leaving the center white. At the very end, we're going to put a glaze over this, and I'll tell you more about how I do that. But for right now, I want this color, the reds and the yellows and the oranges, to all kind of soften and blend together, which is, again, why we're doing it wet on wet. So I use cadmium yellow, alizarin crimson, some cadmium orange, and just kind of put these in here loosely. It doesn't have to be perfect, just kind of using this reference photo as a guide to see where the colors are, building up and layering these colors in. As I do with most of my paintings like this, I'm going to be building lots and lots of layers. So coming in with sort of these lighter colors and then building more towards the end. I'm being really careful around this fox. I don't necessarily need to be because he's kind of in the same color palette as the sky, but I am doing that because I want to remember where he's going to be and I don't want it to get too covered up. My guide, my pencil, I don't want it to cover up too much. I noticed that the paint was kind of just pooling here and I didn't love that. So I tipped my board. Now I'm just using a lightweight masonite board and I tape my paper to that using some masking tape that I actually just get from Harbor Freight. It's super cheap. I'm going to put a link in the description because a lot of the cheap tape on Amazon sucks. Do not use it. You will fight with it, I guarantee you. And the expensive tape, you use so much of it. And so I found that this Stick Tech tape from Harbor Freight is really cheap, less than $3, and it works just fine. I did drop some darker bluish gray in here, and now I usually mix up ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, and alizarin crimson to kind of get a gray mixture. Sometimes I just use the burnt sienna and the ultramarine blue, or if I want something a little more purple, I'll drop in some of that alizarin crimson. But for this one, I'm sticking to the blue and the brown to get kind of a cool gray. And you can see in my reference photo that there are some grayish blue streaks and colors in that sky. Now I'm not going to wait a really long time for my paper to dry before I put in the snow, the colors in the snow. That's because it's very soft where the earth meets the sky, and I don't necessarily mind if it catches that wetness in the sky and bleeds up a little bit. I can always come in later and define that more if I want to. Now, if you're looking at the snow, which is what this fox is standing on, the shadows are very blue and the highlights are very pink and orange. And that's pretty typical for snow. And if you're thinking about shadows just in general, most of the time putting in blue is going to convey that they're a cool shadow. Cool, and I mean cool in color. Not like some really awesome rad shadow that's like super cool shadow, just cool in terms of the color tone. putting in sort of this undercoat of pinks and blues, and you can see where it did sort of touch the sky and kind of bleed up in there, and I love that. So that's exactly kind of what I was maybe hoping would happen. And then just kind of building in more of these warm pink and orange colors in the snow here, while also leaving some of that underlayer showing as like a highlight area. The fox did walk across this snow. That's what it looked like in the photo. So I put a couple spots where maybe there were some footprints, and then building up some of those darker colors. Again, lots of layers, and that's kind of how I tend to work. Your paint will always dry lighter than what you see it when you first put it down on your paper. And then, you know, you can see the shadows of the snow, but you can also see the shadows of the fox, and those are also blue coming from the tail and that back hind leg. And so I'm going to start to kind of put those in here as a guide, and I'll just continue to build those up as we go through this painting. Putting in more of those pinks and oranges, but just a little bit richer this time, and just building those up, kind of blending them into the cast shadow from the fox. Lots and lots of layering. I'm going to go back and put in some of those darker blues where those shadows are being cast, and those are going to be a much darker blue. And again, everything is still a little bit wet, and I'm okay with that because these shadows are pretty soft and I want them to sort of stay that way. So I'm not super hyper focused on whether or not my paper is dry. I'm using a stiff bristle brush, and I do that to lift and soften some of my edges. Lift the paint out, soften some of the edges. You get your paintbrush wet with clean water, dab it off on a paper towel or a rag, and then just work it onto that color to lift that out. And you have to repeat that process, otherwise you're just going to be moving paint around. So if you're truly wanting to lift the color out, like you can see, I just am moving that paint around, cleaned out my brush, dabbed it off to make it so it's not super wet, and then moved it around to remove some of that color. The foxes, for the most part, all kind of this orangey color. You can see the back area, the tail, the hind leg kind of have some browns and grays. The front neck area has some white, and then there's some black on his feet and his ears and his nose. But for the most part, he's kind of orange. So I'm gonna put this under layer of orange in here, again cadmium orange, and then you'll see me use some darker orange like Aussie red gold or quinacridone rust to create some value difference. But for right now, I just want to kind of get this base coat in here of orange, and then start to build and build and build the texture and the layers. So then coming in while he's still wet with a little bit of a darker orange. Again, that's either that quinacridone rust or Aussie red gold in there while he's still wet, because I want that to soften and to spread and maybe just create some texture on its own versus me having to go in there with all of the texture. And so kind of just starting to build those values little by little by little. Now his tail, again, is kind of this brown color, so burnt umber. I pulled that in there and then wanted to pull a little bit of it out around that hind leg area. You can see in the picture reference that there is a little brighter spot around his butt cheek over there. So I wanted to pull that back out and then leave it for later. I just wet my brush, dab it off, and then lift some of that color. And then going in with black. Now I don't use black, I don't even own black. I create black. And again, my favorite way of doing that is to combine ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, and alizarin crimson. The best way to get black is mix complementary colors together. Now, I've gone in and I've dried it off with my hairdryer because I want to put these ears in and the details around the eyes and the nose without it bleeding into the rest of the fur. I've got some nice values going on where I dropped that darker orange color in and it just kind of softened on its own, but I don't want that to happen with this you know, the details of the fur around the legs and the belly and the face. So I wanted to make sure it's dry. So with my smaller brush, I'm coming in and putting in some little dabs of paint here and there to sort of start to say, hey, there's some fur, there's some texture in this fox. And using that darker color, I then also kind of get my brush wet and pull it to soften it so it's not the same value everywhere. It's definitely darker on the torso, underneath the torso, and up around where the torso meets the shoulder, and then up around the ears. You can see where there's some dark value in there where the fur comes together. So I'm focusing on those areas and then just trying to create some texture. Now, underneath his chin, neck area, it's not just white, it's gray, and there's some value and texture in there as well. So kind of just playing with that, and then coming back in to darken up those legs even more, put a little bit of texture in there. There are some stripes in this tail. It's definitely darker along that outside edge, but I'm going to build this in layers just as I am with the rest of the fox. So just kind of doing those dabs up along the back side of the fox, and then around that hind leg is where it's kind of this grayish brown color, so kind of focusing in on that with little tiny brush strokes. Now I'm going to come back and do this cast shadow, and we're going to work this over and over and over again until I get it to a place where I think it works really well. It's definitely darker under his tail and by his foot. So I'm just going to build that up so that it's believable. I just want you to see it and be like, oh yeah, he's casting a shadow. Going back and working on the tail, putting more texture in there, around that hind leg. What I love about layering is that you can let the color that's underneath show through and then put a darker color on top, and it really gives this nice feel to something not being super flat. And so that's why I tend to layer things and work them a little bit. It's not overworking, but just coming in with, you know, layers and textures and paying attention to where the highlights are. So I did that a lot with the fur of the fox and just kind of dabbing my brush strokes in there. Then coming back to the cast shadow and the shadows of these little snowbanks that are in there, we're gonna really start to put those blues in there and working the deeper, darker values. There are some little pieces of grass, they're dead, but they're poking through, so I wanna put those in there because I liked that texture. And then also making sure that I have a little bit of a cast shadow going down and to the left because that sun is across the way. A cast shadow will help to set the object onto the ground, and that's really important. I don't want these things floating. I want there to be some light and to show what time of day it is where there would be some cast shadow. If we didn't have sun coming through and it was a very hazy, kind of just overcast day, you wouldn't have much shadow. So kind of always paying attention to the direction of the light and where those shadows would be is really important, and making sure you do that throughout your whole painting. And putting in some more richer blue here and kind of really starting to tighten up the background and the foreground of the actual ground where this fox is standing, getting those reds and those pinks in there, making sure I leave some of the undercolor for highlights. That's also really important. For the final piece, I'm going to put a glaze, and I did that because I want this sky to be a nice warm color, and I didn't feel like it was warm enough. So the way that you do that, making sure that your paper is fully dry, you mix up some watered down color, whatever it is. For me it's orange, and then I paint it all across the sky and it warms it right up. So how do you think it turned out? Thanks for hanging out today and watching me paint this fox for my niece. Be sure to like and subscribe to my channel. I appreciate the support. Join me next time when I make stuff.
They wonder how I do it like that. 7 fit flex on the jacks on that.